All right, so in this last segment, we're going to start by thinking about public opinion. So Kingdon also asked these same people in the same survey, how much influence does public opinion have? Okay? And interestingly, while there was kind of in the aggregate broad consensus that interest groups matter, public opinion was not seen as being as important. General perception was public opinion doesn't really seem to be driving policy. Now there's some other evidence out there that we can look at that points a different picture, right? So there is good evidence, for example, when we look at shifts in public opinion on an issue, that by far the most common thing that we see that happens, the public makes a major shift in its opinion on an issue, and at some point after that, within the next couple of years or so, government policy shifts to match that change in public opinion. So the public becomes more conservative on an issue, government policy becomes more conservative on an issue. The public becomes more liberal on an issue, government policy becomes more liberal. And it's much more common that it happens in that direction than government policy changes and then the public follows along, right? So in the aggregate, there's reason to think that public opinion really does influence, right? But again, these respondents to the survey, they're asked about it, they said, not really that important. But I think that there are some reasons to think that they would understate the impact of public opinion. Okay? So first of all, let's say that the other side politically is in charge. Presidents of the other party, majority in both houses of Congress in the other party, right? Your preferred policy options are not being implemented, right? Government is not doing the things that you want to do. Do you want to say, oh, they are responding to what the public wants? No, I do not want to say, well, we're getting these policies that I disagree with and I think are wrong because that's what the public wants. And that's why the public elected the other side and didn't elect my party. All right, but let's switch it. Now you are in the majority party in Congress. Now you are president of the United States. Do you want to say, well, we're doing these things because they're popular? No. You're saying we're doing these things because they're right. We're doing these things because they're the best policy, right? We're not just following wherever the polls lead us, right? We're taking a stand and doing the right thing. And they happen to be policy or popular because the public recognizes the wisdom of our ideas, right? The public recognizes that we have their best interest in mind, right? But we're not doing it because it's popular. So whether you're winning or losing on an issue, there's an incentive to downplay the impact of public opinion on that issue. You don't want to admit that the public likes the opposition more than they like you, and you don't want to admit that maybe you're just giving the public what they want for the sake of winning re-election, okay? But there is another factor that I think does often limit the impact of public opinion, and that's that the public is often split on issues. So if we're going to say you're reacting to what the public wants, if it's not clear what the public wants, then how are you going to follow public opinion, right? So if the public's divided on an issue or the public's apathetic on an issue, public opinion isn't really providing clear guidance as to what policy should be. All right, but when we think about some of the more specific ways that public opinion might matter, again, going back to this survey that Kingdon conducts, when it comes to affecting the agenda, it seems like, at least the consensus is, public opinion doesn't have that much of an impact on the agenda. It may set the boundaries. There's some things that are off limits, some things that we don't ever debate, we don't ever discuss, because we know that the public would not be in favor of it. The public would overwhelmingly be opposed to it, okay? When the public puts things on the agenda, it's most likely things that very directly affect the public, right? So we often think and talk about the impact of the economy, for example, on elections, the impact of the economy on people's support for various policies, right? But there's a big difference when we look at different problems that we can have economically, right? So unemployment, for example, can be a big problem, but when we think historically, what does it mean to say we have high unemployment? We're talking about generally something over 5%. So let's say we have 7% unemployment, right? As just our understanding, our interpretation of economic data, we'd say 7% unemployment is bad, right? That's a problem. But it means that 93% of the people who say they want to have a job have a job. So if unemployment is high by our standards of what constitutes high unemployment, but the vast majority of people who want a job have a job, the vast majority of people are not out there lobbying government, pushing government to do something about it directly, right? We may kind of see it on the news, we hear discussions of it, we know a couple of people who lost their jobs, we feel bad about it, but we're probably not out there leading a campaign to get government to do something about it, right? In contrast to that, inflation is a much different story, right? So when we have high inflation, as we've had on and off the last few years, right? It's something that everybody's gonna see, right? Prices on food in particular go up. If you eat, you notice that it costs more than it did before, right? And that can have an impact on you. And so a lot of people are then motivated to say, hey, what are we doing about this problem? And in that kind of situation, the public really can put something on the agenda that maybe elected officials weren't talking about, weren't feeling a need to do something about. When it comes to affecting the options, I would say that's a case where the public probably doesn't do very much. The public doesn't really put options on the table because the public often wants to solve a problem. There might be lots of different ideas in the public about how we solve that problem, but there's very rarely some option that the public is overwhelming. There's a groundswell of support from the public, independent of any activity from the president, any activity from Congress, where members of Congress and the president are being told by the public, we want you to consider this particular option, right? Interest groups carry their solutions around with them wherever they go. They're always willing to pull that out and say, this is what I think we should be doing. Right? The public is much more likely to be at the position of saying, this is a problem, fix it. But you figure out how to fix it. Public can certainly play a big role in putting pressure on elected officials when they are mobilized. And so as a president, you want to make use of this to try to mobilize the public to put pressure on Congress to support your policy, right? But other people can be working to mobilize the public to be in opposition to your policy. Okay, when it comes to trying to understand what public opinion is, right, we want to read the public's opinion. Of course, we rely on polls, and every president since Kennedy has employed a pollster in the White House. And so we have polls that are conducted out of the White House to try to gauge what the public thinks about different issues. Of course, media outlets and polling organizations are running polls all the time. There's lots of access to that type of information. But there are some problems with it. Right? So first of all, what's always been a problem is that we can't always accurately gauge from polls, even when the polls are really good, how strongly people feel about the things that they have opinions on. So the public might say that a majority of the public might say they favor a particular option, but if it's a pretty low priority for most of those people, there might not be any great benefit in pushing that particular policy. In fact, as we've talked about earlier, you might have a very intense minority and an apathetic majority, in which case it's really that minority you have to worry about, right? Whatever I do on the issue, the majority doesn't really care very much. They might smile and nod if I do what they like, but they're not going to be motivated to vote for me because of it, right? And they're not going to be motivated to vote against me if I do something different. But that intense minority who feels directly affected by this, they may be very motivated in their next choice in the election based on what I do on that issue. A bigger problem, much bigger than when Kingdon was writing this, is that for a whole host of reasons that we won't get into today, there's, I think, a lot less confidence in the information we're getting from polls. I'll just give you one of the reasons for that. If you've taken elections and public opinion, we talked about this in that class. But response rates are much lower for polls than they used to be, okay? Because most people don't answer the phone when it's not a number that they recognize. And if I never answer the phone when it's a number I don't recognize, I'm not going to get asked to participate in the poll, so I'm never going to participate in the poll. And so when you see cases, as we frequently do, where there's some pretty big disparities in poll results, right? So I saw before this most recent election this month in the New Jersey governor's race, there were polls that predicted the Democratic candidate was going to win handily and polls that predicted the Republican candidate was going to win handily, right? Now there's lots of reasons that could happen, but probably one of them was low response rate. Makes it less likely you're getting a representative sample that you can rely on to give you good data about what the electorate's going to do. So, even if you're running this poll out of the White House, you could still end up with bad data. I think you're more likely to get bad data out of a poll than you were 30 years ago, right? When most people didn't have the option of not answering a call because they didn't know the number, because you didn't know who's calling anyway, right? I mean, I sound like an old man here, but when I was a kid, right, we had the phone that was connected to the wall, and it rang, and if you were there, you answered it because you didn't know who was on the other end, right? I mean, it could be somebody calling to ask you poll questions, but it could also be a relative who, was in an accident and is in the hospital, right? And you needed to know, so you answered the phone. So if it was that polling organization, well, they got you on the phone, they had a chance to get you to participate in the poll. If I never answer the phone, they don't have any chance to get me to participate in the poll. All right, another aspect in terms of public opinion you want to think about is, I've said the public wants to mobilize the public, right, in support of his policies or in opposition to other policies, but presidents struggle often to get the public's attention. And this is another problem that I think has only become increasingly an issue over time. It's always been a problem. It's even more so now. There's always been competition for the public's attention, but there's even more competition for the public's attention right now. Okay? You can easily make it through your day without ever hearing what the president's talking about if that's what you want to do, if you just don't care to know what the president's talking about. Okay? So presidents can do particular things. They can make use of a lot of repetition, right? I'm not going to assume that because I said it once, the public heard this message. I'm going to repeat this message in lots of different ways and lots of different media and lots of different places and times to try to get through to more people. I can do things like, try to manage media coverage in ways that we'll probably get to next time, although I can never control media coverage, right? I can rely on visual aids to tell the story, right? So one of the key things that presidents like to do, knowing that media outlets are not necessarily gonna, just broadcast their speech, in whole, or maybe even not summarize it in the way that you would want to, is to go stand in front of what it is that you want to talk about. So if the camera's on you, people see. So if I'm talking about education policy and I'm going to speak at an elementary school, it's going to be hard for people not to figure out I'm at an elementary school and I'm probably therefore talking about education, even if they don't know the details of what I'm saying, right? If I'm talking about, bringing jobs back to the United States, I want to go talk at a factory, right? Get that image behind me, okay? So I can try to do that to add to my ability to get the message through, but I can't really make the public pay attention. If I, do reach them, then it matters how persuasive I am, right? Some presidents are really charismatic, they're really great. They get your attention, they can really kind of paint that picture, make that case, get people motivated. Others really struggle with that, right? They have a very hard time getting the public on their side. Of course, public opinion is likely to have less of an impact on presidents in that president's second term, when you know that you're not going to run for re-election again. All right, so from the perspective of the president, right, the public is, potentially an ally if you can reach them, if you can mobilize them. They're also potentially a problem if you can't get that get them on your side and somebody else is doing a better job mobilizing them against you. All right, questions about that? All right, then let's pause for now. On Monday, we will talk about the media, and then again, we'll start in on the next segment, thinking more about foreign policy. But we'll stop there for today. Make sure you're doing the discussion still, and have a good weekend. I'll see you on Monday.